Welcome back to Imagine If. In today's episode, I will be reviewing the top 5 female serial killers. For today's episode, viewers' discretion is advised. I'm your host as always, The Butler. If you have a weak stomach, please consider not watching this video today. I will be diving into the sick and twisted cases of 5 female killers. Everyone in today's episode mentioned is 100% real. These are real cases. If you are new to the channel, please sit back, relax, enjoy the show. Also, if you get any enjoyment out of today's show, please consider subscribing to join this awesome community of the paranormal and unsolved. I post between 3 and 4 videos per week. Without any further ado, let's jump right into the action. First on the list is Andrea Yates. It's not every day that you hear a mother killed her own children. The concept is almost too horrendous to even believe. There's no one on earth that is expected to cherish and to protect their children other than a mother. To just fathom that a person who is supposed to nourish and care for her babies would murder them. You have to ask the question, how did this mother murder her own children? What caused her to go through this twisted path? The story of Mrs. Yates is a tragic one, not only for the children but for the mother too. Now, if your thought is like my first thought, it's very easy to judge this woman who would commit such a crime, such a horrendous act. But if you actually look into the Yates story, you'll see it's possible she was a victim too. There are stops along the way in Yates' life that would make you wish someone had more been involved with her. Mrs. Yates murdered all 5 of her children and took their lives away from them prematurely. Mrs. Yates had both a history of mental illness herself and a history of mental illness in her entire family. Her mental illness did not just appear out of nowhere one day. Unfortunately, she had been battling mental illness for years. Miss Yates hadn't always been in such a sad state of mind and body, spirit. Andrea graduated from high school as a valedictorian and captain of the swim team. She then graduated from the University of Texas School of Nursing and began working as a registered nurse. In 1993, she married a man named Russell and stopped working soon after that. Russell had been a discipline of a preacher who believed married couples should have as many children as possible. It was no surprise when the couple announced they would seek to have as many babies as naturally allowed. Andrea got pregnant with her first child in February of 1994. They continued having children and then shortly after moved to Texas. Following the birth of Mrs. Yates' 4th child, she began showing postpartum depressive symptoms. On June 16, 1999, Russell found Yates in a terrible state. She was chewing on her fingers and shaking. Now, I didn't say fingernails, I said fingers. After a night with pretty much no communication, Andrea tried to commit suicide via pill overdose. Within that day, she was admitted into a hospital and given antidepressants. But shortly after her release, she begged Russell to let her die as she pressed a knife against her own neck, screaming, "Let me die." She was readmitted into the hospital and given a bunch of random drugs. Fortunately, with the combinations of drugs, she began to feel better. Her condition improved greatly, so they authorized her release. She appeared pretty stable for a while, but July of 1999, she suffered a nervous breakdown. She tried to take her own life twice more, which resulted in 2 hospitalizations. Doctors diagnosed Mrs. Yates with postpartum psychosis. One of her psychiatrists, Dr. Starbranch, recommended that the couple not have any more children because she felt it would guarantee future depression and anxiety. Against doctor's orders, Russell insisted that he and Andrea have another child. Mrs. Yates agreed and brought up the risk of the decline of her own mental health, but Russell only complimented her as being a mother and insisted they continue to have more children. Andrea was also told by friends and family that it was the best intentions for her not to have any more children at this time. Unfortunately, the children would indeed pay for Russell's lack of regard. They conceived their fifth and final child just between 7 weeks after Yates' relief. Andrea gave birth to her youngest, Mary, on November 30th, 2000, and her mental health began to decline. To make matters even worse, Andrea's psychiatrist, Mohammed Saad, abruptly took Andrea off her antidepressants weeks before the murders. The couple's arrangement had been to make sure that Andrea and the children were supervised at all times. Russell would watch them when he was home, and Andrea's mom would also watch when Russell was at work. Unknown to Dr. Saad, Russell had altered the plan. Russell started to leave Andrea at home 1 hour at a time in an attempt to slowly build up her independence and confidence. Andrea's mother was shocked when she heard the plan because it was clear Andrea was not fit to care for the children at home. She had almost choked their infant with solid food once before Russell believed that Yates needed a better push. On June 20th, 2001, Andrea Yates drowned her 5 children. She had filled a bathtub with water as soon as Russell left the house. In the hour between Russell leaving and her mother arriving, Andrea brought the children to the bathtub one by one and drowned them. The oldest child was 8 years old, and the youngest was still a baby. She started by drowning her sons, Luke, Paul, and John, laying each on her bed once they were deceased. Then Yates drowned Mary, her infant daughter. When Noah walked in and asked his mom what was wrong with his sister, who was floating in the bathtub limp, Andrea proceeded to also drown him. She calmly called the police and confessed the heinous crime she had done. She was escorted out of the house by state and local police government. During her trial, Andrea's lawyers would plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Dr. Resnick examined Andrea twice during her imprisonment and testified that, in fact, Yates faced a cruel dilemma which turned upside down her sight of right and wrong. During the examination, Andrea had told him she believed by killing her children, she was saving them from an eternity in hell. Apparently, Andrea believed she was a satanic person and that her evil would pass on to her children unless she killed them. One of the prosecution's expert witnesses testified that Miss Yates had gotten an idea to drown her children from an episode of Law and Order, but this was later disproved because the producers said that they had never had an episode that even existed remotely close. One of the sickest things about Yates was that Russell fantasized about having more children. Once she was released, of course, since he believed she would be declared as not guilty. Because Andrea had been declared legally insane, she was found guilty on 2 counts of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison on March 12, 2002. In 2002, the Yates Children Memorial Fund was established in honor of Yates children in the hope of raising awareness for postpartum depression and psychosis. On January 6, 2005, the Texas First Court of Appeals reversed Yates' capital murder conviction. It held a big testimony by psychiatrists that might have persuaded the jury. Russell divorced Andrea in 2004 and remarried in 2006. Shortly after that, his current wife of the time divorced him. Andrea now spends her days confined to the Caryville State Hospital in Caryville, Texas. Egotistical, violent, manipulative, and usually a male. This is a serial killer, Elaine Wuornos. But in 1989, Elaine, after a childhood of abuse and abandonment, went on a killing rampage that made her America's most infamous female serial killer of all time. Despite her heinous crimes, Elaine's unwanted offenses inspired the 2003 film Monster and raised her to almost a cult-like status. In 2002, Elaine's killing spree will earn her the spot as the 10th woman to receive the death penalty in the United States since the 1976 reinstatement of capital punishment. A former prostitute who killed 7 men she picked up while working on the highways of Florida in 1989 and 1990. She showcased that just how fractured a person could actually be in modern America. She found prostitution early in life, trading sexual favors at her elementary school for cigarettes at the age of 11. But she was of course bound by influence. You see, her father was a convicted sex offender, was out of the picture before she was even born, and ended his life by hanging himself in prison when she was 13 years old. Her mother, having given birth to Elaine at the very young age of 17, had already abandoned her by this point, leaving her in the care of her grandparents. Less than a year after her father's death, Elaine's grandmother died of liver failure. Meanwhile, her grandfather had allegedly been beating and raping her for several years. Already having dealt with the tremendous upbringing met with the sustained tragedy, by the age of 15, Elaine dropped out of school to have her grandfather's friend baby, which was a product of rape. However, after having the child, her and her grandfather broke out into a domestic dispute, prompting Elaine to run away to the outskirts of Troy, Michigan. Given her unprivileged background and dire circumstances, she gave up her son for adoption and sustained her life as a prostitute and made extra cash with petty theft. In an attempt to escape her ill-fated life, at the age of 20, Elaine hitchhiked to Florida and married a 69-year-old man named Louis Fell. Louis Fell was a successful businessman who had settled into semi-retirement as the president of a yacht club. By the time Elaine moved in with him, she was already getting into trouble with local law enforcement through local bar brawls and eventual domestic abuse against Louis Fell himself. After only 9 weeks of marriage, Louis Fell filed a restraining order against Wuornos, which forced her to return to Michigan to file for an annulment. It was also during this point where Elaine's brother, whom had been raping her for years, died of esophageal cancer. From his death, Elaine collected his $10,000 life insurance policy, covered the fine for a DUI charge which she had, and blew the rest on a car which she crashed while driving under the influence. After blowing all the money, Elaine returned again to Florida and briefly did time for armed robbery in which she stole $35 and some cigarettes. Going back to prostitution as a means to all end, she was arrested in 1986 when she pulled a gun on a customer and demanded his money. By 1987, she moved in with the hotel maid Tyra Moore, who she became romantically and criminally involved with. Though her story has changed depending on who she was talking to, Elaine often claimed that she was the victim of rape or attempted rape by these men before she murdered them. During her year-long killing spree, Elaine posed as a hitchhiker on the Florida highways, lured the men into remote locations, and then turned on them with a .22 caliber pistol. In the days immediately following her arrest, Tyra Moore made calls to Elaine in an attempt to get a confession that could be used against her on tape. In the calls, Elaine confessed to several of the murders, but insisted over the phone that she killed all these men because they were trying to attempt to rape her. At this point, authorities had what they needed in order to arrest Elaine for murder. Elaine spent all of 1991 in jail, awaiting her trial to begin. During this time, Moore cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for immunity. In confinement, Elaine gradually started to believe that her food was being spat on or otherwise contaminated in some sort. She repeatedly went on hunger strikes and claimed that other inmates and staff were plotting against her. Elaine went on trial for the murder of Richard Malley in 1992 and was convicted 2 weeks later. The sentence was death. Around a month or so later, she pleaded no contest to 3 more of the murders. And in June of 1992, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Charles Constantine and was given yet another death sentence for that crime. After 10 years, Elaine had been diagnosed as a psychopath with borderline personality disorder, and in 2001, she directly petitioned the court and asked for her sentence to be hurried along. Citing inhumane living conditions, Elaine claimed that her body and head were being crushed by a sonic weapon. Finally, on October 9, 2002, Elaine got her wish and was put to death by lethal injection at 9:47 a.m. She declined her last meal and insisted for a cup of coffee instead. Third on the list, Jan Toppelin. Jan Toppelin's childhood began with the death of her mother, who died from tuberculosis when she was a 1-year-old. Her father tried his best to raise Toppelin and her 3 sisters, but had a few screws loose himself. He was a suspect of abusing them, so ended up having to give them away. Jan's father placed her sisters in an orphanage, but not Jan herself. He gave her away. She was only 6 years old when she was given away to a random couple. Her duty to this couple was to be a servant to the household. She took the name of the family who she served and would grow to resent her foster mother, who treated her extremely poorly. When Jan turned 18, she was released from her servant duties but chose to stay in the house years after. Jan's foster sister, Elizabeth, ended up taking over the house once the mother had died, and Elizabeth treated Jan less poorly than her deceased mother. Still, Jan and Elizabeth weren't exactly friends. Elizabeth ended up marrying a man named Omel Brigham, and eventually an unknown dispute caused Jan to move out of the house. Jan then began training as a nurse in Cambridge Hospital in Massachusetts. This is where she earned the title Jolly Jan. Jan was well known for her bright and chatty personality. Jan was loved by all her patients, the ones she didn't murder in cold blood, that is. Or should we say hot blood, since later confessed that it got her hot and heavy to kill them. Despite the fact that Jan was a great caretaker, Her habit of killing patients eventually got her the boot. There was an unreasonable amount of patients who died on her watch, and the hospital became aware of her experiments. Jan ran on patients using high doses of morphine and atropine. Interesting. Even though her bosses at Cambridge were suspicious of her behavior, they recommended her to a general hospital. Jan went on to continue killing patients there and climbing into the bed with them in the general hospital. One female patient at Cambridge Hospital even later reported remembering Jan kissing all over her face. Jan gave her a bitter dose of medicine to knock her unconscious. It wasn't until later, when Jan was arrested, that the patient realized that this experiment had not been just a bad dream. Eventually, the general hospital also let Jan go. If you can believe it, the general hospital also made the mistake of recommending Jolly Jan to patients. She was hired out by wealthy clients as a private nurse. Jan's first documented kill was actually that of an elderly landlord and his wife. Jan later told police that she did love the couple, but they had become too fussy. The husband was killed in 1895, and the wife was killed in 1897. After both were deceased, Jan then proceeded to just use the empty house as if all was going well. Another shocking kill of Jan's was the murder of her own friend in 1889. Jan killed her out of envy, simply because she wanted to take her job as the dining hall matron. She eventually got the job, but then karma somehow caught up with her, because her job as a matron didn't last that long. Jan, well known for sticky fingers by friends, apparently didn't keep her habit of petty death from her stolen job. They fired her quickly. In the summer of 1899, Jan went to visit her foster sister in their old childhood home. Elizabeth complained of depression, and Jan soon whipped up a quick fix for the problem. She put together a picnic with a sarin-laced mineral water. Jan later said that about her foster sister's death, "I held her in my arms and watched the delight as she gasped for her last breath of life." Jan had a plan to profit from Elizabeth's death, but this time she wasn't stealing a house or a job. This time around, Jolly Jan wanted to steal her sister's husband. She soon pushed her way into his life and poisoned him. This dose was not meant to kill. She figured it would play out like a fantasy. As Jan nursed Mr. Brigham back to his health, she assumed he would fall in love with her. Mr. Brigham wasn't having any of it. He made it clear he would never take Jan as his wife, and Jan got so mad after all the trouble she went through to snatch him that she threatened to say he had gotten her pregnant. He threw her out of the house, and Jan attempted to take her own life with an overdose of morphine. How on God's earth a professional poisoner managed to screw up her own suicide by overdose, we don't know, but Toplin was then committed into a mental hospital. Shortly after, she killed their entire family. As always, she did it poison style, but this time somehow had the good sense to be suspicious, enough to do something about it. The husband of one of the Davis daughters who were killed ordered a toxicology report. It came back positive for morphine and atropine poisoning. Police began to hunt down Jan. Jolly Jan was finally arrested on October 12, 1901. She confessed to poisoning 31 people, but she also said that her body count could be as high as 100. Even during the confession, Jan reported to feel no guilt whatsoever. She was reported to saying, "No, I have absolutely no remorse. I have never felt sorry for what I have done. Even when I poisoned my dearest friends, I did not feel any type of regret afterwards. After all that I've done, after all that I've killed, I have the slightest bit of sorrow. Number 4 on the list, Amelia Dyer, born in Bristol, England. Amelia trained as a nurse, which was the Victorian Britain is considered a respectable occupation, and she was able to acquire useful skills for life. However, money was poor, and she took home very little of it. She then learned from a midwife about the existence of baby farmers, people who opened their homes to young women pregnant out of wedlock, who then promised to find adoptive homes for their babies for a fee. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 183 meant that fathers of children were not obligated by law to support their children financially, leaving many women without any other option. These desperate mothers believed their newborns would find a new home in caring adoptive parents as promised by Amelia. The fee was set at €10, which would be about 850 euros today. She was a very respectable woman. Nobody suspected Amelia would be capable of doing any wrongdoing. Many of the desperate mothers had plans to return for their children once their personal circumstances had changed for the better. Tragically, the infants would then be starved to death or smothered. Neglected babies that cried a lot were given a opium-laced syrup known as the mother's friend to quiet them. This led to many deaths by starvations, as babies who were given opium would eventually refuse to eat. Intentionally, a doctor suspected Amelia of mistreating the babies due to the rising number of infant fatalities in her care. Unfortunately, she was charged with only neglect and sentenced to 6 months of labor in 1879. She also spent time in a mental institution, but as a former nurse, she knew how to play the system, so she had an easy ride that included extra privileges. Amelia herself had a history of mental illness in the family, as she nursed her own mother who suffered from severe psychosis, depression, and anxiety. She cared for her mother until her death in 1848, and later the trauma of witnessing her mother die so helplessly was used in her own defense. Later, she returned to baby farming, and at this time did not want the risk of another arrest. She disposed of the babies' bodies herself, instead of asking a physician to supply a death certificate. To further avoid suspicion, she never stayed in the same location for a long time, and took up these aliases to acquire new businesses. She told her own children, curious what had happened to the babies in their household, that she was an angel maker, sending little children to Jesus. Then in 1890, a governess became suspicious when she visited her child who had been left in Amelia's care. The governess ordered the baby to be stripped so she could see her child's distinctive birthmark, but it was not there. This was reported to authorities, and they quickly investigated. Amelia drank 2 bottles of laudanum and opioid mixtures in a serious suicide attempt. Amelia had built a tolerance to opioidism due to a long-term abuse of drugs, and she survived. Due to lack of evidence, Amelia was not charged with any crime, and once again, she returned to baby farming. In 1895, Amelia had moved once again, this time to Kingston Road in Reading. The following year, a package was retrieved from the River Thomas by a fisherman who made the gruesome discovery it contained the body of a baby girl. The Reading police launched a full investigation, and following microscopic analysis of a wrapping paper, they found an address and the name of Mrs. Thomas. When the police raided the house of Mrs. Thomas, they revealed to be actually Amelia Dyer. They discovered the overwhelming stench of rotting flesh. The river was drained, and this resulted in the discovery of more than 50 infant bodies, each with tape still wrapped around their necks. Amelia Dyer was later quoted saying about the white tape that, "How could you tell that was one of mine?" Amelia's house had evidence scattered all over. Amelia, as well, seemed to show no remorse. During the search of Amelia's house, detectives found further evidence, including white edging tape that was found around the victims' bodies and necks, telegrams linked to the baby farming, pawnbroker receipts for children's clothing, clippings of advertisements, and letters from concerned mothers inquiring about the well-beings of their now deceased children. Despite overwhelming evidence, only 3 victims were identified: 4-month-old Doris Malton, 13-month-old Harry Simmons, and 11-month-old Helena Fry. It is believed that she is responsible for more than 300 infant murders, even up to as many as 600. While in custody, she attempted 2 more attempts to commit suicide. The defense tried to spare Amelia the death penalty by pleading insanity, but the jury was not convinced, and it took them less than 5 minutes to find her guilty. On June 10, 1896, she was hung at Newgate. Kristen Gilbert, born November 13, 1967, is a former nurse and American serial killer who was convicted of 4 murders and 2 attempted murders of patients admitted by the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in New Hampton, Massachusetts. She induced cardiac arrest in patients by injecting their therapy bags with massive doses of Irvine, an untraceable heart stimulant. She then would respond to the coded emergency, often resuscitating the patients herself. Her known victims are Stanley Juskoski, Henry Hutton, Kenneth Cutting, and Edward Siraka. Born November 13, 1967, in Fall River, Massachusetts, the elder of Richard and Claudia Strickland's 2 daughters. Richard was an electrician's executive, while Claudia was a homemaker and part-time teacher. As Gilbert entered the teenage years, friends and families noticed that she was habitually lying. She had a history of faking suicide attempts to manipulate people. According to court records, Gilbert has made violent threats towards her family members and friends. She graduated from Dunstable Regional High School. In 1986, she enrolled at Bridgewater State College in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. After a fake suicide attempt, Gilbert was ordered a psychiatric treatment by Bridgewater State College officials. Because of this, in 1987, she transferred to Greenfield Community College in Greenfield, Massachusetts. She graduated from the latter with a nurse diploma, becoming a registered nurse in 1988. Later that year, she married a man named Glenn Gilbert. In 1989, she joined the staff of Veteran Official Medical Center in Northampton. She was featured in the magazine VA Practitioner in April 1990. Although nurses noticed a high number of deaths on Gilbert's watch, they passed it off in a jokingly way, calling her the Angel of Death. A police investigation in 1996 was started on the behalf of 3 nurses who showed their concern about the increase of cardiac arrests, deaths, and the decreased amount of supplies. Gilbert telephoned in a bomb threat attempt to derail the investigation. Gilbert left the hospital in 1996 amid a hospital investigation into many suspicious patients' deaths that occurred during her shifts. That fall, Gilbert checked herself into a psychiatric hospital 7 times, staying there between 1 and 10 days each time. In January 1998, Gilbert stood trial for calling in the bomb threat to the VA. In April of 1998, Gilbert was convicted of that crime. VA hospital staff members speculated that Gilbert may have been responsible for 80 or more deaths and more than 300 medical emergencies. The prosecutor in her case, Assistant U.S. Attorney William Welch, asserted that Gilbert used these emergency situations to gain the attention of her boyfriend, a VA police officer. Hospital rules require that hospital police be present during any medical emergency. Her boyfriend testified against her, saying that she confessed to at least one murder to him while she was in the hospital. Defense attorney David P. Horsey claimed reasonable doubt based on the lack of direct evidence. William Botti, a psychiatrist who served as chief of staff at the Northampton VA, has theorized that she created emergency medical crisis situations to display her love as a nurse. According to court records, Gilbert had made violent threats against others since she was a teenager. At the trial, prosecutors said that Gilbert used a large kitchen knife in an assault in Greenfield, Massachusetts in January or February of 1988. Prosecutors said she tried twice to murder a person by poison in November of 1995. Prosecutors said that Gilbert tried to poison a patient at the VA hospital January 28, 1996, and that she caused a medical emergency by removing the patient's breathing tube at the VA hospital on January 30, 1994. Prosecutors also mentioned that Gilbert abandoned a patient undergoing cardiac arrest November 9, 1995, and then asked another nurse to comply with her. Prosecutors say that she waited until her colleagues independently spotted the patient's difficult issues before raising an alarm. Gilbert forced an untrained colleague to use a cardiac defibrillation paddles on a patient during a medical emergency in November 17, 1995, by refusing to use the equipment herself. Prosecutors said that Gilbert threatened the life of at least one person verbally and physically in July of 1996. While working as a home health aide before becoming a registered nurse, and then about 8 years before her VA crimes, Gilbert purposely scalded a mentally handicapped child with hot bath water. On March 14, 2001, a federal jury convicted Gilbert on 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder. Although Massachusetts do not have the capital punishment law, her crimes were committed on federal property, which opens the window for the death penalty. Gilbert was set to have trial on March 26 of 2001. On March 26, 2001, the jury recommended a sentence of life imprisonment. On March 27, 2001, the judge formally sentenced Gilbert to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole plus 20 years. Gilbert was transferred from a prison for women in Farmington, Massachusetts to a specific federal prison in Texas, where she has remained ever since. She is serving her sentence at Federal Medical Center, Carsonwell in Fort Worth, Texas. In July 2003, Gilbert dropped her federal appeal for a new trial after the then recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling that would have allowed prosecutors to pursue the death penalty. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of Imagine If. If you enjoyed the show, please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Also, remember to hit the notification bell to get alerts on Tuesdays and Fridays for real versus fake scary stories. Bye-bye for now.